You never know when you're going to get an opportunity that is unlisted or unadvertised because of networking. Hey everyone, I'm Laura Forsick and I have had a successful space career for the past 20 years. And the key to my success has been networking. Networking can get a bad rep, but I want to show you exactly how reaching out to people, connecting with people, and offering to serve people in whatever way you can be mutually beneficial and extremely beneficial for your career. Here in this video, I'm going to outline how I got my first 2 full-time space jobs and a few part-time jobs by networking. It still surprises me how successful I was at getting jobs just by having connections and being willing to put myself out there, being willing to talk to people about what I was able to do, what I was willing to do, and then have them see the excitement and the enthusiasm and have them give opportunities to me. This is my first time using a whiteboard for a YouTube video, so let's just see how this goes. I want to take you back in time, about a decade. I was a late-stage graduate student. I was volunteering running a National Space Society branch, and I was also on Twitter. I was not posting at that point, not tweeting, but I was reading. I was reading pretty regularly. One of the things that I was doing as a graduate student was running equipment in a lab. I was a planetary scientist, but I call myself an experimental planetary scientist because we were doing a lot of analog research in laboratory, and my equipment broke a lot. And so one summer, the equipment was going to be broken for quite some time. And I decided to reach out to somebody I knew who worked at NASA Kennedy Space Center, who was doing related research. He and I had hit it off. He was on my, what do they call it? The board for graduate students. I've already forgotten, the dissertation committee. So I reached out to him and I got one of my NASA internships that way. My gratitude to NASA Space Grant Consortium, because they funded me that summer. It wasn't anything I actually applied to. I simply reached out to this colleague of mine at NASA. I said, hey, do you have any work for me to do for 3 months? And I honestly didn't think I'd get paid for it, but they made sure that I got paid that summer working on that internship at Kennedy Space Center. So that was very much just networking. In fact, I think I've gotten almost all of my internships by networking. Another cool thing that came about through networking was that my graduate advisor knew somebody who's very well known in the commercial space sector. And at this point, I was purely a scientist with an interest in commercial space. So I didn't have a lot of connections or involvement in commercial space yet. But my advisor introduced me to someone who was doing a series of advocacy publicity stunts, let's call them. And he was doing different events on the same day, coordinated around the country to raise awareness about planetary science budget for NASA being cut or potentially being cut. And I ran the event, let's call it, for Central Florida. And that was really fun. It got me on the news. I hadn't really been on the news before. So that was really a great way to get involved. And that was purely through networking. That was me saying to this colleague who I just met, this acquaintance, I'd like to get more involved. And he hooked me up by, asking me to lead this little event that he was coordinating around the country. So another cool thing that I got involved with through running a local National Space Society chapter was a annual initiative called Florida Space Day, which is still going to this day. I was just a graduate student, so I was at the time the youngest person to participate, and I pretty much just forced myself in. But we became an official sponsor of Florida Space Day at the lowest tier so that we could participate, we being my National Space Society chapter. And what that did, me and my vice president, we went up to Tallahassee, Florida annually for a couple of years and went and advocated for space to the Florida state government, which, if you've ever lived in Florida or if you live in Florida now, you know that they're very supportive, but they still need reminders of what's going on and why it's important and what the future should bring. And as a graduate student, that was so exciting for me because I had a budding interest in space policy. And so it was really cool for me to get that opportunity to do advocacy work right there in Florida. I continued on to run a subcommittee and be involved in both the big committees of Florida Space Day after after I was a graduate student too. Now, this is the only opportunity I'm going to mention that is not directly related to networking. Advertised on Twitter, I applied for a part-time position for a small market research company that was involved in space that exists in a different form now. But back in the day, they were brand new. They hadn't even been around a year yet, I think. And they were ramping up their analysis team. And I joined initially just as an intern, but very quickly got promoted to run the analyst team for this company for over a year. So that was a part-time job. I applied, so it wasn't through networking, but it comes into the story later, so I wanted to mention it here. One really cool thing about knowing the individual who I had met through my graduate advisor who got me involved in that publicity stunt advocacy event was that he was starting his own startup, which, spoiler, didn't make it. I was so excited about it, but because I was so excited about it, he knew my excitement in getting involved in all things commercial space, and at that time, there wasn't a lot of moon stuff going on. So this was very, very early moon company that would probably fit in really well right now. But a decade ago, it was a bit too early. However, just by networking, just by talking to this individual, he offered me a part-time, very, very part-time position involved in this startup. And that was just really cool to me. I would have loved for that to turn into a full-time job. We were talking about it, but it never got off the ground. So not everything works out completely as you wish it could. And along those same lines, that internship that I spent that one summer doing just by networking with somebody I knew at NASA Kennedy Space Center, that introduced me to that team there at Kennedy Space Center doing really, really cool things having to do with in situ resource utilization and robotics and all the things we talk about now on the moon. Back then, again, it wasn't so moon focused, but it was completely moon focused, really, truly. And the team lead for this, which is not the person I initially contacted, but the person above him, his boss, he really, really tried to get me a full-time job, civil servant role at Kennedy Space Center for after I graduated. Now, if you've ever tried to get a civil servant position made, you know how difficult it is. It is actually nearly impossible. It's not impossible. I've seen it happen, but it is very, very difficult to actually get a full-time NASA position made without somebody else leaving. And so that never happened. But I really appreciate that he tried to get me a full-time job at Kennedy Space Center. And I wonder how my life would have been different, how my career would have been different if I had been a civil servant at Kennedy Space Center from the start. Now, these two roles working together. Now, this again was me volunteering through the National Space Society chapter that I was running to participate in Florida Space Day, plus the part-time job that I was doing remotely with a very small space market research company led to an unofficial part-time job. And now, when I say unofficial, I mean there was no contract, there was no application, there was no offer, I was not paid, but this was a job I essentially created for myself. It was truly a job. I was out there trying to get an initiative done. I was so very involved in this project that I essentially made myself a job and nobody told me no. In fact, they were acting like it truly was a job that I was paid for. They were calling me up, they were involving me in this and that. Like, I was so heavily involved. I think people assumed that I actually did have this job that didn't exist. There was no real job. But if this had actually happened, this project went nowhere eventually, but if this had actually happened, I have no doubt that it would have turned into a full-time job simply because I was the one who was leading it under people who actually had full-time jobs to do this. So really, really cool effort. It would have been cool if it was, paid. It would have been cool if it had turned into a full-time job, but that's not the way it turned out. And I'm ever so grateful for the mentor who took me under his wing and really, took on this graduate student, this young professional who had no business doing any of this because I wasn't hired to do it, but really, really encouraged me and taught me. Finally, first full-time job was gotten through both the involvement that I had done through this planetary science publicity stunt event. That same man, I'm also thankful for his mentorship. The same man who hired me for this part-time position that in his startup that didn't actually come into fruition as a full-time job. He was on the board of advisors or something, board of directors, I don't know, for a small space organization that we now know today as the ISS National Lab, which was my first full-time job. At the time, I was still actually a graduate student, so I had been looking only for part-time work, but they were looking for somebody full-time. They really didn't have a science team back then. I was their first physicist. My networking with that individual who back here, my graduate advisor introduced me to, being involved with what he was doing led to me getting my first full-time job in the space sector. If you remember my involvement with the National Space Society, which got me involved in Florida Space Day, which also got me this unofficial job working on a project for economic development in the state of Florida, led to my second full-time position. This one took a while to develop because what had happened was through LinkedIn, somebody had contacted me, and this individual was looking for ways to connect with the organization that was doing this and doing this. And so I knew all those people because I was working with them. And so what happened was I introduced these people to these people, and through several months, maybe even a year of conversation, finally, these people decided to set up an office in Central Florida in Kennedy Space Center area. And I was the person that had been coordinating it the whole time. So I was the obvious choice for them to hire as the manager of this new branch of this space startup that I hadn't even been looking to switch to. They made me an offer. It was a great offer. I was really excited about the company. Didn't work out. They went bankrupt, and that's when I started Astrolytical after that company went bankrupt. But you can see the lines. All of this through networking, except for the Twitter one. But all of this rest of it is entirely through networking. And it would take me an hour probably to go through all the other ways that networking has benefited me with other types of opportunities and other types of internships, part-time jobs, that kind of thing. Now, you do not need to network in order to get a job. You can go ahead and apply through the traditional way, but I highly recommend doing both. I recommend going through the traditional application process and networking at the same time for maximum results. By networking, you can maximize your chances of getting a job or an opportunity. And here's the trick. Sometimes by networking, you can even write your own job. This happened to me when I was between grad schools for about 3 months. There was a job at NASA Marshall Space Flight Center that was looking to hire a replacement for somebody, and they hired me on for 3 months as a temporary position. I wrote my own job description. There are some places that need to openly compete, and sometimes even if you're applying online to a position, it might have actually been written for somebody else, or the prime candidate has already been chosen before the job has even been posted. And so it's not fair necessarily, but this did happen to me where I was the one who was the prime candidate, who was the one who was getting this job, even though it was publicly posted, and I fit that job description perfectly because I wrote it. So you never know when you're going to get an opportunity that is unlisted or unadvertised because of networking. This is also how I get the majority of my clients in my business. And if you are a business owner, please talk to me about how Astrolytical, my space consulting business, can help you to grow in space. And if you are an individual looking for your way into the space industry or way to grow your space career, contact me at lauraforsick.com, and I'm happy to talk to you about space career coaching. Let me know how I can help.